Hey guys, it's Dorian here. Welcome back to the channel. I hope all of you are doing well. Today we are going to dive into my favorite Nintendo gaming accessory. That is the Nintendo GameCube's Game Boy player. It is the successor to the Super Game Boy that was on Super Nintendo and the Super Game Boy 2, which was only released in Japan. I also want to take a quick moment and say a quick shout out and thank you to my friend Andrew, aka Black072 on Twitch. He gifted me the Game Boy player and I've been loving it ever since. Once again, thank you, my dude. If you're wondering what the Game Boy player is, it's fairly straightforward. It is a full hardware based of a Game Boy Advance that supports playing Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games on your Nintendo GameCube. There is no emulation, this is completely original hardware. However, there is a little bit of difficulty to play this on the Game Boy player in the year 2023. In fact, it's hard to find a Game Boy player disc that came with the actual unit. Those things usually go for at least $100, maybe $150 nowadays. I personally do not own the Game Boy player disc. At some point I would love to have it just for my own collection, but there's actually a better alternative out there. If you're familiar with the Game Boy player scene, then you probably know what I'm going to say. It is the Game Boy interface, also known as GBI. The Game Boy interface software was written by Extrems, who is an amazing individual who has put many hours into his craft of creating a great free alternative to the Game Boy player boot up disc. What truly separates the Game Boy interface software from the classic Game Boy player boot up disc is the accuracy and customization that you can do. And best yet is that there's settings and modes that are available to have reduced input lag and improve image fidelity. In my example here, I have my Nintendo Game Boy hooked up to my GameCube. I also am using the official Nintendo component cables, which are quite rare and a little pricey nowadays. And I'm using the HD Retrovision Super Nintendo for the audio out for left and right channel. To round things off, I'm using the Retrotink 5X Pro upscaler. What this device does is it allows you to take your original video game consoles and upscale them to a high definition signal. However, your mileage may vary depending on what cable setup that you're using. And now pairing that with the Game Boy interface software specifically made for the Retrotink 5X Pro, the image that you guys are seeing on the screen is truly astonishing and amazing. In my estimation, it honestly looks like a computer emulation of how well the analog signal is converted to a digital signal. There's very little noise and the colors just pop, and the razor sharp edges on the sprites of the little characters you see on the screen just look so darn good. Now you might be wondering, how does one actually boot into the Game Boy interface software? There are multiple ways to go about this, but to keep things just straightforward and how I do it with my system, I will be listing out the steps. So first off, I'm using the SD Media Launcher Game Disc. This particular software allows you to boot into specific homebrew applications. I bought this off of eBay for a great price of $30 Canadian, but that price and your luck may vary. Next up is you need a SD card less than 2 GB of space. I lucked out and I found on the local used market for a SD card of only 1 GB, and this card's been great. And also, as you can see, I'm holding in my hand, this is the SD card to memory card adapter, which allows you to plug in your SD card into the memory card port on your GameCube. I will have links in the description for all these products, but again, the SD Media Launcher disc is not too common, but I know other people have used the Action Replay that supports the Wii. There are two homebrew applications. We've already discussed about the Game Boy interface, but now we'll need the program called Swiss. First off, go to the GC Forever wiki, look for Swiss on the page that we have here, then go to the right and go click on download. From this point, you'll be taken to a GitHub. You will want to scroll down until you find the Swiss R15. These numbers are going to change with different versions. So once you have that, now we can safely extract it to a location on our computer. Now you'll need your SD card to plug into your computer, and again, you want to make sure your card is no more than 2 GB and it's formatted in FAT, not FAT32 but FAT. To do that, right click your drive, go to format, and look at the current file system. As you can see here, I have mine set to FAT. I have my volume label, you can name it whatever you like, but I chose to call it the GameCube. Go ahead and proceed, and now you're formatted. Now we are ready to move over all of our Swiss files, so open that up. As you can see, there's multiple files and folders. Let me highlight them all and quickly just drag and drop. I'm putting these onto the SD card. This is going to take a few moments here. Now that we've completed the installation of Swiss on our SD card, we will now need to grab the Game Boy interface software. On the same website, GC Forever Wiki, you will want to look up the Game Boy interface. Again, I will have all the links in the description down below. You'll now want to click on the Download Main Packages. Now that the download is complete for the Game Boy interface software, we can now go ahead and drag and drop all of our folders and files over to our SD card. This will take a few moments here. With both homebrew applications installed to our SD card, there's one thing I like to do to speed up the process on booting. What I do is I take the current swiss.dal file, I like to bring it back to the root of our SD card, paste it, and I change the name to autoexec.dal. This will automatically boot your homebrew SD media launcher into Swiss. Now that we have installed all the necessary homebrew software for our SD card, we can now go ahead and plug it into our GameCube, fire it up, and I'll show you what's next. As you'll see here, it's going to quickly boot up into the SD Media Launcher, and from that point, it's going to automatically boot into Swiss, the homebrew program. Now that we're in Swiss, we can go to the memory card slot B, which I put my SD card in, go to Apps, and look for the Game Boy interface. As you can see, there's a lot of different versions of it. For my setup, I'm using the Game Boy Interface High Fidelity OSSC, which is compatible with the Retrotink 5X Pro. Now you're ready to play any Game Boy, Game Boy Color, Game Boy Advance game of your choice. Again, this is how my current setup is, but I gotta say something real quick. I personally do like the Nintendo GameCube controller for GameCube games, but when it comes to playing Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, the D-pad, in my estimation, is just not very good. That's where I like using a Super Nintendo controller. The folks over at Raftnet Technologies have created a neat adapter called the Super Nintendo Controller to Wii/GameCube cable. What this does, it allows you to hook up an original Super Nintendo controller to play on your Nintendo GameCube and your Game Boy player. I find the mix of the controls, the buttons layout, and the D-pad, it is the ultimate way to play Game Boy games, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance on the big screen. I'll be sure to have the link down below if you are interested. And before I forget, if you happen to still own a Game Boy Advance or a Game Boy Advance SP and a Game Boy Advance link cable, you can use that as your controller for playing the Game Boy games on your television. Let me know, guys, what was your first Nintendo gaming handheld system, and what games do you remember that you enjoyed the most? For me, my first Nintendo handheld was the Game Boy Color Atomic Purple. I still have mine from the very first day I had it, and it still holds up quite well. It works, and it is a true testament to Nintendo's durability and longevity on these devices. I personally enjoyed the heck out of Pokemon Yellow, Mickey Raceway, and Super Mario Land 1 and 2. With the Game Boy player that is 20 years old, it is truly amazing to know that back in 2003, Nintendo had a vision of allowing us to play our old little handheld games on the big screen. And with the 3 generations of Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance, there is a vast library of games to be played. In the year 2023, we have all sorts of different technology advancements and software developments, with the Game Boy interface being a true successor and a replacement to the Game Boy boot up disc, and along with the Retrotink 5X Pro upscaler, these games never looked better. Again, your mileage may vary depending on what cables you may use, and with using the Nintendo official component cables, it looks delicious. Also, if you guys have any video game suggestions, please let me know in the comments down below. I'm always looking for new games I can play on the big screen on the Game Boy player. If you happen to not own a Game Boy player for your Nintendo GameCube, don't worry, there are other options readily available that might be best suited for your needs. First off is the device from Epilogue called the Game Boy Operator. This is a simple plug-and-play device that you hook up to your computer, which includes an integrated emulator, so you're off and running to play your original cartridges. One of the best features of the Game Boy Operator is you are able to back up your old video game saves that were on your cartridge. Eventually, some of the batteries inside the Game Boy carts die, and which means that game save progress data is lost. Not all Game Boy games include a battery, but those that do, many of them are going on 20 to 30 years old at this point, so to give you peace of mind, it might be wise looking into having a brand new battery installed. Another great choice, and if you're interested in original hardware, is the Game Boy Consolizer. If you happen to have an older Game Boy Advance that has a non-working screen, this would be an ideal candidate. Basically what it does is it allows you to turn your existing Game Boy Advance into a home console and play your games on the big screen. It's a pretty darn cool device. I would say this is aimed towards those who are more tech savvy and familiar with soldering, as that is involved, but nonetheless the end product is pretty darn cool. Another device is the Analog Pocket. This device is a handheld that looks very similar to a Game Boy, but it allows you to play a variety of different game cartridges, not just Nintendo. There are optional adapters that are readily available that you can play the Sega Game Gear, Neo Geo Pocket, and the Atari Lynx. One thing to note, the Analog Pocket does not include the analog dock. So if you want to play your games on the big screen with the Analog Pocket, you'll need this dock. And of course, I must mention the MGBA, which is an open source Game Boy Advance emulator. It's pretty cool. It's come a long way since its inception, but it is something that might be ideal for you, especially if you do not have the hardware capable at home. In conclusion, in the year 2023, the Game Boy player for the GameCube is truly an amazing device, allowing us to play 3 generations of Game Boy. It is my favorite Nintendo gaming accessory. I just want to say a quick shout out to my friend Andrew, Black072 on Twitch, for this amazing gift he gave me a few years ago. I had a lot of fun revisiting my Game Boy player and checking out all the Game Boy, Game Boy Color, and Game Boy Advance games in my library. Please let me know down below, how are you playing your Game Boy games in the year 2023? Are you still rocking your classic Game Boy, Game Boy Color, maybe the Game Boy Pocket, Game Boy Advance? Very curious to hear what you have to say. If you guys happen to enjoyed my content there today, by all means feel free to subscribe. Love to have you guys come back and return. And if you liked it, by all means feel free to like it and all that YouTube stuff. Thank you very much for your kindness, generosity, and support. If you have any questions or comments, statements, feel free to post them down below. I do like taking the time to read and respond to each and every one of them. Thank you for watching, and have yourself a great day.